Good afternoon, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to the 8th Berwick Literary Festival. My name is Christopher Smith. I'm the chair of the Festival Trustees, and I'm your host for this particular session on this Friday afternoon. Can I just bear a few practical points with you before we start the actual session proper? Could I ask you firstly to make sure that your cameras and your microphones are turned off. I'm a tech idiot, and it took me a long time to realize that what I had to do was to click the two little things down on the bottom, mute and stop video, and click them in such a way that a red line moves transactionally across them. So make sure that that's please done, otherwise it'll cause a bit of chaos for our tech hosts and for Andrew and me. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is the format of this particular session with Andrew Lownie is mainly that of an interview. We hope we will leave time at the end for questions from you all. And if you want to ask a question, you will see a little box at the bottom of your screen called Q&A, questions and answers. Please press that and put your question into there. Now, I can't guarantee, because I know there'll be lots and lots of questions, I can't guarantee that all the questions submitted will be able to be answered by our speaker. But I'll do my very best to offer him as varied a group of questions as possible in the last period. And I know he'll be very happy to answer all your questions. So, to our speaker, Andrew Lownie is a long-standing friend of our festival. Right from the start in 2014, as a literary agent, which he is, he's allowed us access to his authors. He tells me that he was educated at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and was the Dunster History Prizeman and President of the Union before taking his Master's and Doctorate at Edinburgh University. He's a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a visiting Fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge, and the President of the Biographers Club. He's a writer, a bookseller, and a journalist writing for the broadsheets and eminent journals. He's also the author of acclaimed books about the Mountbattens, Guy Burgess, and John Buchan. And today, I will be exploring with him his latest work entitled The Traitor King, the Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Without further ado, therefore, it's a delight and privilege to welcome Andrew Lownie to this year's Berwick Literary Festival. A very, very warm welcome to you, Andrew.
Thank you. Delighted to be back.
Yes, lovely to see you. Now, last year, Andrew, I enjoyed interviewing Alexander Lahmann, who just published a book on the crisis which led to the abdication of King Edward VIII. Now, in some ways, your book, which, if I may say, and advise the audience, is an absolute page turner and an absolutely fascinating read. It takes us beyond December 1936 and the abdication and into the lives of the Windsors post-abdication. Now, my first question is this. There are already lots and lots of books on the Windsors. Why do you feel that we needed another?
Well, as you say, there have been lots of books, but they all tend to stop in December 1936 or cover that period in a few pages. And the Duke lived for another 36 years afterwards, the Duchess for 50 years. And I think the period afterwards is as interesting, if not more interesting, and of course sheds fresh light on the abdication. My argument is that he wasn't forced to choose between his wife and the throne, that he was maneuvered out because of his pro-German views and his unsuitability to be king. And in many ways, this story has been hidden because the archives here have been weeded and the myths, in a sense, there's been a curation of the story by various writers. And the focus has been on 1936, when actually the focus should be on his activities afterwards.
That's very, very interesting. And I'm very interested about, of course, you have a particular interest in getting hold of correct archives, have you not? And I've had problems with other archives. I believe the Mountbatten archives have caused you some problems in the past and still. But I'm very interested, as I was reading this book, to look at the wealth of documentation that you provide in your footnotes. You obviously researched this subject incredibly well, and there must be lots of new research. And I'd be very interested to hear from you, and I'm sure our audience will, what in fact these new evidences were, where you found them, and what archives you explored to give us this fascinating and riveting view of the post-abdication Windsors.
Well, most writers, I'm afraid, are rather lazy, and they just copy out bits from other people's books. And I'm trained as a historian to go into the archives, and the archives have been there. Not necessarily in this country, because as I say, the archives here have been weeded, but there was material in French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Russian, and particularly in the Bahamas, where there was a mirror set of files from the Colonial Office, but which hadn't been weeded. So it shows you just what's taken out when you see what actually should be there. And the other thing is there's material in private archives that people never bother trying to find. So I often try and trace descendants. You find that people have kept material. Indeed, there was material from one of my sources just down the road for you from Berwick. And I think the two killer bits of information in terms of the focus on the Duke's treachery, because this was sort of known about, but everyone in the past had sort of put 2 and 2 and drawn the conclusion of 5, that though he had intrigued with them, he wasn't an intriguer. And it seemed to be pretty obvious that he wasn't just flattered by their attentions, he was perfectly prepared to come back and be a British Pétain. And the two killer bits of information are from Alan Lascelles' diaries, who's the monarch's private secretary, and from the diaries of an MI5 officer called Guy Liddell, which both confirm that the Duke, even after he was on his way to the Bahamas and ostensibly was no longer interested in coming back as a British Gauleiter, he was still communicating in code with the enemy during wartime, a capital offence, to say, yes, I'm ready to come back and take my stand and come back as the new king. And that was pretty shattering. I mean, frankly, the Queen's uncle should have been executed for his treachery.
Could you talk about the weeding of the files? I mean, can you tell us a bit about the Marburg files and what happened to them?
Well, one of the bits of convincing information is that the German archives were actually recovered at the end of the war. The plan had been to destroy them, but for various reasons they weren't destroyed, partly as a calling card for a man called von Losch, who used them to barter for his safety. And this was the correspondence between Ribbentrop's foreign ministry and the Duke of Windsor, known, as you say, as the Marburg files or the Windsor files. And this is devastating stuff because it shows just how actively he was involved with the Germans. And when this was discovered in May 1945, the British were appalled, but there's nothing much they could do because it was the Americans who had the material. And though Churchill lobbied Eisenhower very hard for the stuff to be destroyed, the American historians said these are important historical documents and we refuse to do so. So there was a long campaign to diminish their value, to delay their publication, and to spin them, and to say these were reports from diplomats who didn't know what they were talking about. But the fact is, we have all the chapter and verse in these documents. Now, not all of them have been published, and some of them are missing. So, for example, the Duke met Hitler in October 1937, and the minutes of that meeting is missing. And that's, of course, part of the course, because when you're researching controversial areas like this, the material has generally been weeded. That's what governments do. The other interesting disclosure was that there's always been rumors of correspondence between Windsor and a Nazi general, a cousin of his called Philip of Hesse. And Anthony Blunt, at the end of the war, had made a mysterious mission to Kronborg Castle, the home of the Hesse family, supposedly to recover this correspondence. And that's always been denied by the authorities. And there's never really been any evidence that there were letters there, until in the diary of a British officer who was stationed at Kronborg, I found in Keble College, Oxford, details of him going into the library and finding these papers. So the thing is, the papers are often around if you just look hard enough.
That's marvelous, and you know this comes over very clearly, because the interesting thing to me, apart from this depth that you've gone into, and the fact that you are very clear that he was a traitor and should be shot, to quote you. A lot of people would say, well, he was only doing the same sort of thing. I know this is you actually, I think, convinced me that your position is correct. But there are a lot of people who might just say, now come on, I mean, he was no worse than all this set of people around the place in the 30s, led by people like, you know, the picture in the book of Lady Cunard. And was it the Cliveden set? Some of the Cliveden set were involved in this, the Astors and so on, who really thought that, you know, Hitler was a jolly good thing and that we shouldn't go to war again. And there was that group who were positively pro-Nazi, and then another group until the war started, and then another group, of course, who were in the appeasing camp, who were never pro-Nazi as such, but the Halifaxes and decent people like him, who were so horrified at the idea of another war that they tried at all point to stop him.
Yes, you're right. I mean, there was a perfectly respectable position before the war. I mean, Chamberlain, after all, his whole policy was based on the appeasement of Hitler. And indeed, other members of the royal family, including George VI, were fully in support of that. He actually brought Chamberlain out onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace when he came back from Munich. I think the difference is that the people, by the time of by 1939, realized that Hitler couldn't be appeased. But what surprised me was that those peace negotiations continued. So, for example, there were overtures throughout 1940, including the summer of 1940. And Churchill was aware of these, and he allowed them to run. Now, sometimes you just let people talk to see what they come up with. But you're right, people like Halifax and Butler and Lothian and others were in negotiation with the Germans through the Vatican, through Switzerland, and through Sweden. Because, of course, it did look very dodgy. I mean, the Germans had swept through France. They were actually pressing on to invade Britain. And the feeling was that we would lose the empire. And the Duke's position was that the real enemy was communism, and that's what Germany should be concentrating on. The Duke was very pro-German. He was 14th, 16th German. His mother was a German princess. He spoke fluent German. He spent a lot of time as a child in Germany. And so he was very sympathetic to the German position. But I think the big difference is that he continued to not only entertain and encourage peace moves. I mean, for example, in January 1940, he came back to Britain from his posting in France and intrigued behind the back of Chamberlain with Beaverbrook to try and create a peace party. He tried to dissuade, to encourage the isolationists in America before December 1941. So he continued to push that line, even when we were at war. And as I said, here he is communicating with the enemy in code. He's actually got a position. He's been posted to the Bahamas by Churchill, who's already threatened him with court-martial for his behavior. He's a government servant, and he's still actively in discussions with the Germans against his own country. He's actually encouraging them, for example, to bomb London because he says it's during subjugation. He hasn't reported any of his discussions with the Germans to the British. His maid has been allowed to go to Paris and recover goods from their home. He's absolutely in bed with the Germans. And indeed, he continued to say that Hitler was a good chap until the day he died, and remained very anti-Semitic, and said the Jews needed to be controlled. He had a lot of very anti-Semitic friends. One of his best friends remained Oswald Mosley. So he genuinely believed this stuff when everyone else had realized that this really wasn't on.
Yes, I think one of the most shocking things that you quote in your book is the Spanish foreign minister when he says, as you said, he throws all the blame on the Jews and the Reds and Eden with his people in the Foreign Office and other politicians, all of whom he would like to put up against a wall. If the Germans bombed England effectively, this could bring peace. Now, you're quite right. I mean, it's absolutely, that's the Spanish foreign minister, quote, I think, in communication with the Germans. And there's another point where the German ambassador says, the Duke believes that continued heavy bombing will make England ready for peace. So there he is, actually sort of thinking that people have got to be bombed into submission, really. But if I go on Sorry, Andrew. Yes.
Sorry, I mean, he believed in strong government. He believed in the Führer principle.
Yes.
You know, and that was one of the problems why no one wanted him as king, because he
Well,
was intriguing before the war with the Germans. He tried to downplay the remilitarization of the Rhineland to government officials. Sorry.
yeah, no, that's quite right. Because the other most interesting thing is that you've got this man with his very anti-Semitic views. It comes out in Bahamas anti-race, very racist views, and also he's married to a woman who receives every day or so the mysterious Father Odo, the Jesuit priest who wasn't a German spy, but no doubt was telling the absolute truth when he said that she received from Ribbentrop every day 17 red carnations, which were symbols of the 17 times that she slept with him. And also this lady the American lady who did the portrait of them for an American magazine, who said that she kept in the Bahamas a picture of Ribbentrop in her toilette. And it would seem to me that he was bad, she was even worse. And
Exactly. The
could
Germans
you
had targeted.
tell us a bit more about the Duchess and her pro-German views?
Well, the Germans realized that Wallace was very pro-German, and they targeted both of them. They realized the relationship began in 1931, and they actually sent off a spy called Stephanie von Hollenhau to actually take the apartment next to Wallace in Bryanston Court, and to draw her into the circle of Emerald, Cunard, and others. So they were doing that. They sent Ribbentrop, who she was friendly with. Whether she slept with him or not is sort of, I'm not sure about. I wasn't there, but she was certainly close to Ribbentrop, and for the simple reason that they could all work together to try and influence government opinion. So she was as bad as him. She had very similar views. It was one of the things that drew them together. And I think also there was a very strong personal element here. It was a way of getting back at the establishment that they felt had treated them very badly, and a way for the Duke to get back at his family. But she encouraged him in these views all the way through and shared them. And as I say, the Germans had been basically targeting them since the mid-30s. So it wasn't a surprise when war broke out that there were attempts to recruit him for the Nazi cause. It had been going on for years.
It's very interesting. The other interesting thing is, if you could tell us a little bit about this, it's implied in the book, but one of the interesting things about the abdication was that Churchill was one of the greatest supporters of Edward VIII remaining king and not abdicating. And then, of course, Churchill becomes the great prime minister who advocates that we must not give in to Germany, and we're going to fight with every might and muscle against the Nazis, who could see the evil of the Nazis. How do you think Churchill shifted his position on the Duke? The Duke moans to him at one point when he's being firm with him that, we used to be friends. And it's a fascinating business how Churchill actually shifted. Can you explain a bit more about that to people?
Well, Churchill was a great romantic, and he had a great loyalty to the crown, and so he, in a sense, was the head of the monarchist party. He felt that he didn't really know the Duke that well at this point, or the king, but he was romantically and emotionally sort of supportive of the king staying. But he realized that the king wasn't prepared to fight. I mean, he said, "Our cock won't fight." And he remained in touch where he was, I suppose the relationship really broke down in the summer of 1940 when he was aware of the treachery of the Duke, and how sort of petulant he was, refusing to come back unless they sent a destroyer because he had so much luggage, refusing to give up his valet for military service because he wanted him. So I think he was irritated by then. He then became aware of the treachery. And by the end of the war, when these documents had been retrieved, he knew exactly what he was like, and the same with the royal family. I think the problem was they had to cover up the scandal. Churchill actually refused to go on a cruise on Onassis's yacht in the post-war period because he really wanted nothing to do with the Duke. But I think he realized that the Duke had to be given some sort of job. He couldn't be totally frozen out, or he'd get up to more mischief. And so he did come across to Paris a few times at the end of the war, after the war ended, to try and find some role for the Duke. But no one could find anything. He clearly couldn't do anything in business. There was no role for him in Anglo-American relations. There were attempts to foist him on a South American embassy. He really didn't have the skill set to do anything useful, and he was a constant embarrassment with these unfortunate associations with Nazi agents and with his financial skullduggery, which we haven't discussed. But he was always dealing in the black market and doing currency transactions, which were illegal. And indeed, it got to one point with his secretary, John Waddilove, that it was discovered, and Waddilove threatened to go to the press with the story, and Waddilove had to be sacked and paid off to cover up the scandal. So he was an embarrassment to the government, and Churchill, was fed up with him despite his loyalty to the crown. He'd also shifted his allegiance to George VI, and so when Edward wanted to write his memoirs, Churchill asked him to downplay Churchill's role in the abdication because he didn't want to fall out with the king.
Yes, right. Because what you describe in the book, it's not simply about, and I'd like you to move on to this for a bit, actually, because it's quite fascinating. The whole story post-abdication of these two very unpleasant people is quite remarkably in their unpleasantness. For instance, could you just tell people about the way that when they went to the States, when England was being blitzed? Tell them a bit more about that, because that's quite fascinating, isn't it? The way that they had no concern at all for the English people when they were in their shopping street.
Tinea for bad publicity. So, clearly when Britain's been bombed, petrol's been rationed and all these things, they're taking extensive motor tours around the States with 80 pieces of luggage, which is so much, they have to be stored in the corridors, making extensive shopping trips, not always paying their bills, assuming that little people can somehow cope. They're lucky to have the custom of the Duke. They treat their staff very badly. They sack them with no compunction. They don't pay them properly because, again, it's an honor to work for them. Their butler, who worked for them for 40 years, when his wife died and asked for time to be able to leave at 5 to take care of the young children, was told if he did so, he needn't come back. They were very disloyal to their friends. Freddie Metcalfe, his best man and ADC, who'd given up his career to serve him and was with him in Paris when the Germans advanced. The Duke literally abandoned him one night, took the petrol in the car and left Fruity to make his own way home. And that happens time and time again. They exploited their position by getting paid to go to parties. They would vet guest lists. They would sponge off people. They never put their hands in their own pocket for anything. They were able to negotiate deals, for example, for their cross-Atlantic ferry cruises. They were just very self-entitled, spoilt and selfish people who, thank goodness, they married each other, because they would have made two other people unhappy. I mean, in some ways, the Duke was unhappy because she bullied him, was very dominant, called him buzz-off mosquito. And she was unhappy because she was stuck with this very boring man that she never wanted to marry. She was emotionally blackmailed into doing so because he threatened to kill himself. So actually, far from the happy ever after, the two of them were chained together in a nightmare marriage.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting feature that, for instance, Tommy Lascelles, is it Tommy Lascelles, says to Harold Nicholson, he has no friends in this country, nobody whom he would ever wish to see again. He was without a soul, and this made him a trifle mad. He never cared for England or the English. He hated his country since he had no soul. And this business about no soul, and it seems that we were saved quite remarkably from probably the worst monarch in several or many centuries. There's this soullessness, and you've described how it affected their behaviour. How do you think it affected him as a person? Because he seems to have been rather retarded.
Yes, he was very simple. You know, I mean, you would have thought he was educated to be king, but I think your point about the soul is absolutely right. I think that gives us an understanding of what made him tick. He had certainly no inner life. I mean, he didn't read. You know, when Churchill gave him a copy of a book, he said, "I'll stick that in the bookshelf with the others." He didn't listen to music, except perhaps to sort of musicals. And so, for example, when he heard a Mozart concert, he said, "That's nice. Has he written anything else?" He was he was incredibly ignorant. I mean, as was she. They lived a very superficial life with very superficial people, and had no sense of any sense of public duty. It was all private pleasure. And I think that's what made him, made him unhappy and made him so restless. And he knew that his wife had given up everything for him, and he felt, I think, guilty about that. And of course, she was able to survive by having her own affairs on the side. And indeed, they had this bizarre bisexual sort of sex life with a man called Scotty Bowers procuring young kids for them. So they lived a pretty shabby and pretty pathetic life, really.
Sort of rackety, really quite rackety life. Yes, yes, quite amazing. It's very interesting when you know, the attention span thing, because when he's trying to write his memoirs, the chap Murphy, is it, the ghostwriter?
Yeah, Charles Murphy.
Talks about his lack of being able to concentrate for very long. And could you tell us a bit more about those two memoirs, The Heart Has Its Reasons and The King's Story? Because that's their way of trying to get back into the affections, I suppose, of people, which they'd obviously lost quite heavily.
Yes, I mean, they both wanted to create the story, shape the narrative. In fact, though they're writing about the same events, they actually have slightly different versions. And particularly Wallace went through several ghostwriters because they just didn't believe a word she said. But it was an attempt to make some money, which his made quite a lot of money, hers slightly less, but his sold well. I mean, it's the only time we've had a monarch write a memoir. Until we, and that's why Harry's book will be very interesting to see what he says. But it's yeah, they made some money. They were able to get back at people, not just at members of the royal family, but also, for example, Baldwin, who had shafted the Duke. I mean, you say we were very lucky not to have the Duke as king. That's thanks to Baldwin. Baldwin maneuvered him basically into a position where he was forced to abdicate. If he'd been a bit cleverer, he would have been able to survive this. But Baldwin realized what an awful king he would be and used the pretext of Wallace to get rid of him, and brought in the Dominion prime ministers whose opinion he knew would be very anti the Duke. So, I mean, the abdication needn't have happened if the Duke had been a bit smarter.
But given the person he was highly unlikely that he could be smarter, isn't it? That's the sort of the catch-22 situation. You mentioned Harry there. I mean, we've got this King Edward VIII, who's a sort of lost child, really. Well, Harry's a very different sort of nature to that. But obviously, he's married an American. He's in America, and he's about to write his memoirs. I mean, people could make all sorts of dangerous, I think, or unpleasant links between the two, which would not be founded at all. But you did actually mention him. Would you like to just explain a little bit more?
Well, I think there are lots of connections. I mean, this is the story of a prince going into exile, being taken away by an American divorcee, a charismatic prince who is a modernizer, who is, one could argue, is destroyed by the establishment. There are the same debates about finances, about security, the same blaming of parental bad parenting, the same breakdown of a relationship between brothers who've been close, the same tension between two sisters-in-law, the constant suing of the press, the exploitation of the royal brand. Windsors were promoting things like linen and cutlery. I think there are a lot of parallels. I mean, what we don't have is the pro-Nazi views of Harry, but then we have sort of rather, we have a wife who is shaping his views towards, being woke. We have the hypocrisy. So I think the playbook is back in play, and I think the difference now is we have a slightly less deferential society, so things get reported, and we have social media, which allows things to spread. But the Duke certainly used the media to shape his narrative. And we have the same thing where the British are actually rather anti the Windsors, and the Americans think the Windsors are wonderful.
Yes. I think it would be very interesting now, if you're happy, Andrew, to open it up to people and to continue the conversation. Would you be happy with that?
Yes, of course, absolutely.
Yes, lovely. Well, let's just see what we've got in terms of question and answer coming up now. Here's a good one, a lovely one. This is from Michael Wright. Given your account of these two unpleasant people, did you find any redeeming qualities in them at all? From Michael and Pamela Wright.
Right, I'm afraid I didn't find much. I mean, I've written about a Russian spy, and at least there, he had a certain charisma, and I felt sorry for him, and I think he had made a huge sacrifice in terms of his spying. With them, I didn't find much. I mean, they liked dogs. She could be quite witty. I talked to someone called Cordelia Guest, who was a god, or the sister of a godson, and she said they were very sweet to children. So, I mean, I suppose there were some elements. Nicky Haslam, who knew Wallace in the 1960s in New York, said that she was always very good company, but she was always rather brittle and rather wicked with her wit. I mean, there wasn't a kindness there. But it is hard. I mean, you could say that he was besotted by her, but I think that says quite a lot about the sort of odd psychosexual relationship they had. And I think eventually, after he died, she realized that she had been quite fond of him, which is often the case with widows. But there were very few redeeming qualities. I mean, people have written books, and maybe on the early life, there was more there. But I think just from the comments that were made by people who knew them well, and there are lots and lots of them. It's not that I picked them selectively. I found it very difficult to find things that were praiseworthy. But perhaps earlier on in their life, they were slightly more attractive. I mean, I think the thing is, the public image of the Prince of Wales was always good, but that was because the press were very deferential and just reported things. And the people who really knew what he was like realized that he was lazy and stupid and very selfish and not at all, had no sense of public duty whatsoever. He was bored by the job, which is why he was quite happy in some ways to abandon it.
Yeah, you could say that in the latter part of their time in the Bahamas, wouldn't you say that certainly Wallace did some rather good stuff? I don't think he did particularly.
Yes.
It'd be interesting just to talk about the Bahamas and, of course, the murder, which is very interesting. Can you just tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yes, no, it's a good point. I mean, I think Wallace did rise to the occasion in the Bahamas. She was involved in children's clinics. She cooked at the canteen for the British base. She did try to improve the lot, particularly of the blacks, who were very much kept down. He, I think, did far less. He was pretty impotent because it was sort of run by a group of businessmen called the Bay Street Boys. And so all he could do really was drink and play golf and occasionally turn out for parades. The Oakes's murder, I suppose, ties into all this because this is again one of the great scandals. Oakes was probably the richest man in the Bahamas. He was a Canadian who went there as a tax exile. And he was very close to the Windsors. They'd actually stayed in his house when Government House was being redecorated when they first arrived. Oakes was part of a sort of financial triumvirate with a man called Harold Christie. Christie was a property developer who Oakes basically used to help develop the island. And Christie double-crossed him and they fell out, and Oakes decided not to use Christie. And I think my argument is that Christie was then brought in henchmen to kill Oakes because he could see that his livelihood was going and wanted to shut him up, really. And this was all covered up. But where the Duke gets involved is he was the third member of that financial group with Oakes and Christie. And they were busy trying to get money out into Mexico through a Nazi bank. And so when Harold Oakes is murdered, the Duke is one of the first to be told. He institutes a news blackout. He then, instead of using the Commissioner of Police, he sends him off to Trinidad to get him out of the way. He doesn't call in Scotland Yard, but two bent coppers from the FBI in Miami. And he tries to control the case. He, in fact, tries to frame Oakes' son-in-law, Alfred de Marigny, who would have hung if he'd been convicted. But fortunately, the defense points out that these two crooked cops have actually planted fingerprints of Marigny at the crime scene, and he's let off. No one is ever convicted of the crime, but I think it's pretty clear that Christie ordered the crime and the Duke knew about it.
There we are. Here's Jenny Foley. A question here, which is this. Given how absolutely appalling the Duke was, both personally and professionally, has writing the book changed your opinion about the whole concept of monarchy? The whole concept of monarchy.
Yes, well, exactly. No, the more one reads about these people, the more you think maybe the concept of monarchy isn't a good one. But here we had a sort of safety valve, but like we were lucky. But you're right. If we don't have the right candidates, then we're in trouble. And I was, and I remain a monarchist. I think they do provide a form of stability and a focal point for the nation. But people have to, in a sense, earn that respect. And it's one of the tropes of the crown, this divide between public duty and private pleasure, which actually runs through the royal family. So you have the royals who don't want to do their public duty and prefer private pleasure, like the Duke, like Prince Andrew and Harry. And then you have clearly people like the Queen, and I would argue William and Kate, who are more prepared to do their bit. And we just hope the Williams and Kate predominate, and the Harrys and Meghans fall away.
Indeed, you could sort of say that it was providential the way that things happened, because I go on holiday to Suffolk occasionally, or most years, and there's a little church in a place called South Cove, which has a flower festival and always has these pictures, a thatched church. It always has these pictures of the history of South Cove. One of the great history of South Cove is that in the 30s and the 20s, more in the 20s, there was a boys' camp run in Suffolk, and it was run with Bertie, the future King George VI, who obviously took his duties very, very seriously indeed. And there's these lovely pictures of him sitting in the middle of all these boys with bell tents behind. So really, in a curious way, it was quite providential for the monarchy and for the country, I think, that in fact, things turned out the way they did. Would you agree with that? I think Absolutely. You say so at the end of your book, don't you?
Exactly. That's how I conclude the book. Absolutely. I think we were lucky, and it could easily have been very different. And there's a lot of fiction. I actually have a section at the end of the book with all the fiction about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And much of that fiction is about what would have happened if they had become the king and queen. And there would probably have been a deal with Hitler before the war. Our history would be very, very different. Or if he had come back in 1940 again, there would have been some deal. And history would have been different. So it is a problem. I mean, how, with all his training, how could he prove to be so bad? And there was so much warning. His father had said that boy will ruin himself within a year. And in fact, he took 324 days to do it.
Yeah. So, are there any other things which in the fiction which throw up interesting things? Because it's clear. I can't remember. There's a lovely, interesting quote that you make about the King Edward, the Duke of Windsor, after the abdication, right to the end of his death, where really he hadn't changed his views at all, had he?
No, I mean, he remained friendly with Mosley. He kept saying that Hitler was a good chap, and he remained very anti-Semitic. So he learnt nothing, and that's what's extraordinary. And what we also get is the postal censorship records from the war, and even throughout the war, when we were much more aware of the hideous nature of the Nazi regime. he was still, both of them were still speaking out openly about how wonderful they were.
Yeah.
So they were incredibly naive, but I think he had this strong sense of as I say, the Führer principle, that you know, strong government. He was very Germanic in his way. In fact, as he got older, he would break into German at dinner parties. He was very friendly with Rex Harrison's wife, Lily Palmer, and they would talk German together. And even when he went golfing in Palm Beach, he would break into German to these amusement of these American golfers. So, you know, and there are pictures in the book of him dressed in his lederhosen and stuff. He liked schnitzel and apple strudel. He was more German than he was British, really.
Another question from Helen Wright. Andrew suggested that the Duke should have been executed for his treachery, as you said earlier on in your talk, in your response in the interview. If that indeed had happened, what might have been the impact on the institution of monarchy?
Well, I think it would have been cataclysmic. I mean, we had a cabinet minister's son, John Amory, executed, and that was bad enough for doing, again, far less. I suppose it would have shown that you know, the monarchy could be pretty ruthless and it could deal with its own. But I think it would have all just been covered up. I mean, there would have been an attempt to kill him. In fact, when he was in Spain and Portugal in the summer of 1940, there was a man called Peter Russell whose job was to shoot him if necessary. And I think there would have been something would have been done to just knock him off and save any embarrassment. I mean, I think there's a wonderful plot about a kid, you know, to kidnap him or to assassinate him in the Bahamas, because there was very little protection there, and it'd been very easy for a submarine to turn up and to capture him or kill him. And indeed, it would be very easy for the British or the Americans to do that themselves. Think how easily Oakes was killed.
Next question is an anonymous attendee. How aware do you think were King George and Queen Elizabeth of the depth of the Windsor's treachery?
Well, we know that George VI was briefed by Lascelles in May 1945. In fact, literally as he came off the balcony of Buckingham Palace and on VE Day. So they were perfectly aware of what was going on. I know that there were extensive reports on his activities from his special branch protection officer, from MI5, who were bugging him, the only monarch to be bugged. There would have been intelligence reports sent to the king, and we know that from just the correspondence. So I think even before 45, George VI would have been well aware of what his brother was doing. And of course, we had the ultra decrypts, so we knew a lot of the communications with the Germans. So, and there were people in their entourage who were reporting on them, not just the detectives, but other members of staff, and indeed friends. And when he was posted to the French First Army, he had an MI6 officer attached to him as an interpreter, just to keep an eye on him. So I think there was plenty of information getting back to everyone about what he was up to.
Another question from Sophie Margaret Hamilton. From things I have read, the Duke lived a pretty wild sexual life prior to meeting the Duchess, as did two of his brothers. Can you account for the different persona of the future George VI?
Well, she's absolutely right. I mean, Edward had lots of girlfriends. I mean, mainly married, but he would have flings when he was on his tours, and girls would be brought out to him, and indeed out to Mountbatten when he was with him. The Duke of Gloucester had this affair with Beryl Markham, and we know about the Duke of Kent, who had a whole series of bisexual affairs. But actually, I think what people don't realize is that Bertie also had various affairs before, and I understand after his marriage, that he wasn't quite the goody-goody that we all imagine. But I think there's a very strong sense, particularly in the aristocracy, that love, marriage, and sex are three very different things. And that view, I think, was continued by Edward. And you know, a lot of people have argued that he was impotent, that there was no sex life with Wallace. But the fact is, both of them were highly sexed, had extensive sexual lives before they got married. There was no reason why that should change after they got married, and indeed, it's pretty clear it didn't. They were swingers, really.
The character Jimmy, quite a remarkable character, wasn't he? He was the lover of Wallace, and this is after they got married, wasn't it? This
Yes,
very gay man or
yes. The affair with
bisexual man.
the affair with Jimmy Donahue, who's an heir to the Walworth fortune, really stretched over 4 or 5 years, and we know about it from, for example, French Secret Service surveillance reports. And he was, as you say, bisexual. I mean, actually very camp, but she enjoyed his company. He made her feel young. He picked up a lot of the bills, which was attractive to them. I think there's a suggestion the Duke was also attracted to him and was quite happy for him to be in those circles. He enjoyed Jimmy's company. And the wits quipped that that Wallace had given up a king for a queen. But it's yeah, and there were others. Russell Knipe, a dancer and a singer, she was also involved with, and there's supposedly others. But and there's suggestions that he was involved with a man called Walter Chrysler, the son of the car manufacturer, an actor called Clifton Webb. So this is the story that's never really been told, and it's very difficult to find. I mean, I found the love letters to to Clifton Webb, on an auction. They've been auctioned by Clifton Webb's estate, but you're not going to find that in the Royal Archives, and that's the problem, finding the material. And I suspect there's a lot of stuff tucked away in archives or in private collections that may well one day find the light of day and again shape our perception of the couple.
Can I ask a question from my particular standpoint, having been a chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen, who takes her religion very seriously, as I think did her father? And there's no evidence at all, is there, in anything that I've read about them in the last two festival sessions, to suggest that he had got any sort of religious views at all?
No.
Did you find any?
No, he didn't,
Just
and that's
not
a good
at all.
point. It's a good point. Exactly. I mean, the Queen, has a very strong religious faith, and Prince Philip clearly was very interested in religion. But I mean, even Lord Mountbatten, his great friend, at least was sort of an adherent to Church of England services, but he hardly went to church. Briefly when he lived in Paris in the 1930s, but he had no interest in religion, but he had no interest in anything in terms of, say, the spiritual or anything except the very, very superficial.
Yes. Well, there we are. I think we're coming to the end of. I've got no more questions to ask, and we've moved pretty fast, Andrew. I think through
covered a lot of ground. Great questions. Thank you.
Yes, it's been marvelous. And so we're coming to the end of our session now, and I'd like to thank you enormously for the way that both for the book, which I'll show people in a minute, just to remind them, but also for the way that you've sped us through all sorts of stuff, which I hope will give people a taster to want to purchase the book. It is, as I was saying earlier, a very, very good read. Not only is it very, very weighty in terms of its academic background and all the stuff that's there, but actually it reads incredibly well. And if I may say so, I'm not being patronizing at all.
No, try. Scholarly and readable is what I try.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. It's scholarly and it's readable. Now, if you're in Berwick, you can get the Traitor King at Greaves Bookshop. It is also on the bookshelves of all good booksellers. That is correct, is it not, Andrew?
Yes, it went straight into the Sunday Times after 4 days, Sunday Times bestseller list.
Isn't that good? And also, presumably, people can buy it online at Amazon, can they?
Yes, absolutely.
Yep. So there we are. Buy it, a very, very good read indeed. So many thanks indeed for giving us your time and your expertise and your enthusiasm. It's been excellent to be able to share this hour with you, and hopefully it's been very good to converse with you, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, what I love, I think the Berwick Festival is a wonderful festival, but what I love about festivals is you often find people have some connection with the subject. I'm just seeing in the chat someone in Portugal who knows about the visit to Portugal there. So, I mean, I often pick up fascinating things as a result of giving these talks and interviews.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much indeed. Can I also thank all the audience today who've listened to our conversation and have taken part in the question and answer, very interesting question and answers which have come up. Please publicize this event. It will eventually go out on social media after the festival's over. And also, please, if you can, continue to publicize the festival, because we've got another 2.5 days of very interesting stuff to come. You will remember, of course, that it's a voluntary charity. Nearly everything that's being done is done by volunteers. All this excellent tech stuff, and many thanks to the tech stuff, they managed to get me, who's utterly pretty technically sorted out. But you know, you've got our tech stuff, you've got all the people in the background, and it's almost entirely voluntary. But of course, there are expenses. And so, whilst it's a free festival, if you wish to donate to it to make sure that it goes on continuing to grow and to be the friendly festival in a walled town for many years to come, then the way to do it would be to give us a donation of whatever you would like to do so, a generous one, we hope. So you can find the details of how to do that on the closing slides, and also you can go to our website. As I say, there's 2.5 days left of fascinating presentations which are yet to come. You can see them all in the closing credits, and I would like to thank Andrew again for his willingness and his expertise and his knowledge over the last hour. And my best wishes to you all, and look forward to seeing you all again, hopefully next year. Thank you very much. All the best.